Welcome to Stories from the Front. Take a second to like, subscribe, and activate notifications. Chicago seemed a world away while I was defending Stalingrad. I'm Frank Bradley. My decision to join the Red Army in 1942 surprised everyone except myself. The frozen streets of that besieged city became the stage where I discovered my true purpose, even if it meant fighting under a different flag. The first impact upon arriving in Stalingrad was the sight of the Volga River. Its dark waters carried dozens of makeshift boats, transporting supplies and soldiers under constant German artillery fire. As an American, I was a curiosity to the Soviet soldiers. Many looked at me with suspicion, at first others with genuine curiosity. Commissar Petrov was the one who welcomed me, a stern man with piercing eyes who spoke surprisingly good English. "Comrade Bradley," he said, "there are no Americans or Soviets here. There are only soldiers defending every inch of this city." His words marked the beginning of my transformation from foreign volunteer to true defender of Stalingrad. Our position was in the tractor factory, transformed into a makeshift fortress. The industrial complex had become a maze of trenches and firing points. My first trench mate was Nikolai, a young man from Kiev who taught me my first words in Russian and shared his maworka with me, a strong tobacco that Soviet soldiers smoked. The nights were the worst. The cold penetrated our ill-fitting uniforms, freezing even our thoughts. I quickly learned that the Russian winter was as deadly an enemy as the German troops. We shared thin blankets and took turns keeping watch, always on the lookout for the slightest movement in the ruins in front of us. The first major offensive I faced was a literal litmus test. The Germans began with an artillery bombardment that turned our world into an inferno of explosions and rubble. The air became thick with dust and smoke, making it impossible to distinguish day from night. Nikolai was shouting orders in Russian, and even though I didn't understand every word, the tone of his voice communicated everything I needed to know. In the midst of the chaos, I saw young soldiers, some of whom looked like teenagers, holding their positions with a determination that impressed me. One of them, Anton, was no older than 17, but he handled his machine gun with the precision of a veteran. During breaks in the fighting, he showed me photos of his family in Leningrad, a city under Nazi siege. The fighting in the buildings was a nightmare of close combat. Every room, every corridor could hide an enemy sniper. We learned to move like ghosts among the rubble, using the shadows as allies. The constant noise of battle became part of us, like a deadly symphony that never ceased. One afternoon, during a particularly intense counterattack, I lost Nikolai. He was covering our retreat when a grenade exploded near his position. There was no time to mourn, we had to keep fighting. His death taught me a hard lesson about the reality of war here. Life could be cut short in an instant without warning or goodbyes. Commissar Petrov kept us informed about the general situation of the battle, although we suspected that the news was filtered to keep morale high. Even so, his constant presence on the front lines inspired confidence. He was not just a political officer, but a true leader who shared our risks and privations. Food shortages became critical as the siege intensified. We shared small portions of frozen bread and thin soup, dreaming of meals from home. The rats became bolder, invading our positions in search of scraps. Some soldiers began to hunt them to supplement their meager rations. In the midst of all the destruction, I witnessed extraordinary acts of courage and humanity. I saw doctors treating the wounded under intense fire, messengers crossing death zones to deliver crucial information, and soldiers sharing their last slice of bread with starving civilians who refused to leave the city. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Stalingrad became our entire world. There was no more past or future, only the immediate present and the need to survive until the next dawn. The ruined city was our home, our prison, and our battlefield. Winter deepened, and with it our determination grew. Every meter of Stalingrad was marked with Soviet and German blood. Every building had its own story of sacrifice and resistance. I, an American far from home, had found a cause worth dying for and comrades worth living for. In Stalingrad, I soon learned that every ruin had a name, every rubble a story. The building we were defending was known as Pavlov's house, although for us it was simply our fortress. There, between broken walls and shattered windows, we waged our own private war against not only the Germans, but also the merciless cold and constant hunger. I vividly remember one night in particular when the thermometer read -20 degrees. Vasily, a veteran sniper, taught me how to stop my hands from freezing when handling the rifle. "Urine on your fingers," he said with a crooked smile. "It's not elegant, but it keeps you alive." It was the kind of knowledge you wouldn't find in any American training manual. Our daily routine was a mixture of monotony and absolute terror. We spent hours observing enemy positions through small gaps in the walls, every suspicious movement of which could mean the start of a new attack. The constant sound of artillery had become so familiar that we could identify the caliber of the shells just by the whistle they made as they cut through the air. One afternoon, while we were sharing a tin of corned beef, a rare gift from a supply convoy that had managed to cross the Volga, Ivan, a Moscow history teacher turned soldier, told me about his family. His wife and daughter had been evacuated to the Urals. "You know, Bradley," he said, carefully wiping every drop of grease from the can, "here we learned that life is made up of moments. This piece of meat, this minute of peace, could be our last." The Germans began to use dog bombs against our positions. It was a cruel tactic that deeply affected the morale of the troops. Many soldiers, including myself, hesitated to shoot the animals. It was Marina, a sniper operating in the neighboring sector, who made us understand the harsh reality. Those are no longer dogs, they are weapons. Choose them or their comrades. Urban combat had its own rules. We learned to communicate by tapping codes on walls, developed techniques for identifying traps, and most importantly discovered how to predict enemy attack patterns. The Germans were methodical, almost predictable in their precision. We used this against them. One morning, after a particularly intense bombardment, we found an intact piano on the third floor of a partially destroyed building. Sergei, a young musician from Leningrad, played Tchaikovsky while we stood guard. For a few moments, the music overpowered the sound of gunfire. Even the Germans stopped firing. It was one of those surreal moments that war sometimes brings. Hunger was our constant companion. We ate everything we could find: moldy bread, rats, even the leather of our belts. Commissar Petrov organized nightly expeditions to look for food in the basements of abandoned houses. It was risky, but necessary. On one of these missions, we lost 2 men to snipers. Winter intensified, and with it our determination. Each soldier carried with them a story of loss, but also of hope. Yuri, a young man from Stalingrad, was fighting just a few blocks from his old home. When the war is over, he used to say, "I'll plant a garden where every bomb fell." Evenings were filled with stories whispered in the trenches. Soldiers shared memories of home, dreams for the future, deepest fears. Amid the horror of war, these conversations kept us human. I especially remember one young man, Dmitri, who carried seeds in his pocket to plant when we get back. He explained, even though we all knew that many would not return. The sound of German boots in the snow became an omen that we learned to fear. They tried to approach silently at night, but the cold betrayed their presence. We developed a sixth sense for detecting movement in the shadows, a skill that only survival can teach. The city itself seemed like a living organism, breathing through the explosions, bleeding through its destroyed buildings. Each new day brought different challenges. Sometimes it was the need to ration ammunition, sometimes the urgency of rescuing a wounded comrade under heavy fire. The war gave us no time to hesitate or question. Christmas 1942 arrived quietly in Stalingrad, marked only by the howl of the biting wind and the occasional artillery shot. That night, as I took shelter in our fortified position, I heard Soviet soldiers softly singing traditional Russian songs. The melancholy tune made me think of Chicago, of the family I had left behind, wondering if they would ever understand my decision. Commissar Petrov gathered our unit for a special meal, a can of corned beef for every 3 men, and a small piece of chocolate that he saved for special occasions. "Comrades," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold, "every day we resist is a victory. Every German we prevent from advancing is a step closer to liberation." Our position in the factory had become a veritable labyrinth of improvised defenses. We used the abandoned machines as cover, turning the assembly line into a fortress. Anton the young sniper developed an ingenious system of alarms using wires and empty cans which alerted us to enemy approaches at night. One morning, during a reconnaissance patrol with Marina, the sniper, we witnessed something extraordinary. A group of civilians, mainly women and the elderly, were working silently removing rubble to create a makeshift vegetable garden. "Look, Bradley," Marina whispered. "While we're fighting for the city, they're fighting for their lives. That's why we can't lose." The battles became fiercer and fiercer. The Germans, frustrated by our resistance, intensified their attacks. We learned to save ammunition by making every shot count. The Silly taught me the technique of hunting in pairs, while one shooter watched the other prepare to fire. It was a deadly game of patience and precision. The cold began to take its toll. We lost more men to frostbite than to enemy bullets. Ivan the teacher was constantly developing new techniques to keep us warm. We discovered that old newspapers, when placed between layers of clothing, provided surprisingly effective insulation. One night during a particularly intense attack, I was trapped with Sergei in a partially collapsed basement. For 12 hours we held our ground, sharing the last drops of water and stories from home. He told me about his dream of playing the piano in concerts again, while I shared my plans to write about this war one day. The shortage of medical supplies was critical. Our nurse Natasha worked miracles with what little we had. I saw her use vodka as a disinfectant and tear her own uniforms to make bandages. Her dedication inspired us all. In war, she would say, sometimes the will to live is the best medicine. Hand-to-hand combat in the buildings was brutal and silent. We developed our own language of signs and gestures because a single sound could mean certain death. Yuri, with his experience on the streets of Stalingrad, taught us how to identify the Germans' favorite traps and avoid ambushes. Commissar Petrov kept a detailed diary of our operations. One evening he confided in me that he was documenting everything so that future generations would understand the true cost of war. "It's not just the battles that need to be remembered," he said, "but the humanity that persists even in the darkest moments." The stories of heroism multiplied. Marina took out a German sniper who had been tormenting us for weeks. Anton, despite being wounded, held his ground alone for hours to protect the retreating civilians. Each small victory was celebrated as if it were decisive for the whole war. Hunger changed us. I learned to value every crumb of bread, every sip of muddy Volga water. Dmitri, always optimistic, managed to find edible roots in the rubble and shared them with everyone. His generosity, even in times of extreme scarcity, taught me a lot about the human spirit. January 1943 arrived with even greater violence. The Germans, now surrounded by our counteroffensive, fought with the desperation of cornered men. Our position in the factory became a crucial point of defense, and Commissar Petrov warned us to expect the worst. One morning after a particularly difficult night, I found Marina checking her rifle. She told me about her life before the war. She was a math teacher in Kiev. "Numbers are predictable, Bradley," she said, adjusting her aim. "Here, every shot is a different equation. Distance, wind, breathing. One mistake, and you lose a comrade." Our unit had developed a deadly efficiency in urban combat. Yuri led small groups on reconnaissance missions using his knowledge of Stalingrad streets to avoid ambushes. We learned to identify the weak points of the German formations and exploit every possible advantage. The cold became even more brutal. We lost 3 men in one night when they fell asleep on guard duty. Their bodies were found completely frozen in their positions. Ivan started organizing short shifts and implemented a system where the soldiers constantly poked each other to stay alert. Our diet consisted mainly of a paste made from rye flour and Volga water, occasionally supplemented with whatever we could find in the city cellars. Natasha, our nurse, insisted that we chew each mouthful slowly. "It fools the stomach," she explained, "and keeps you alive longer." One afternoon, during a rare moment of calm, Dmitri organized a small, impromptu celebration. He had saved some potatoes found in a cellar, and most impressively, a small bottle of vodka. We shared this treasure while he played a patched-up balalaika. For a few hours we forgot the horror around us. The fighting in the buildings intensified. Every floor, every room became a miniature fortress. Anton developed an effective technique of using broken mirrors to observe corridors without exposing himself. "It's like playing chess," he used to say, "but the pieces shoot back." Commissar Petrov kept our spirits high with news of the Soviet counteroffensive, although we sometimes noticed hesitation in his voice. One evening I found him alone, studying a map by candlelight. "You know, Bradley," he confessed, "sometimes I wonder if we'll survive to see the victory we're building." Sergei kept finding moments to play his imaginary piano on his frozen fingers, moving them in the air as he whispered melodies. "Music keeps you sane," he explained. "When everything is destruction, we need to remember that there is beauty in the world." Our combat routine had become almost mechanical: patrols, ambushes, defending positions, searching for supplies. Each day brought new challenges and losses. Vasily kept a small notebook in which he wrote down the names of fallen comrades so that they will never be forgotten, he would say. The constant sound of artillery created a macabre symphony that blended with the distant screams and explosions. I learned to distinguish each type of projectile by its sound, a skill that saved my life more than once. "The Germans are precise, even with their artillery," Ivan observed, "but we know this concrete held better." The ruined city had become our home, our prison, and our battlefield. Every destroyed building told a story, every bullet-riddled wall carried memories. Amid the rubble and ice we continued our fight, not just for survival, but for the very soul of Stalingrad. February brought a noticeable change in Stalingrad. The morale of the German troops began to weaken, while our determination was strengthened by the news of Soviet advances. Commissar Petrov gathered us together to share information about the siege that was closing in around the Germans. For the first time I saw a genuine hope in his tired eyes. Marina had set up an observation post in what was left of a water tower. "The Germans are changing," she told me one morning after her vigil. "Their movements are more erratic, desperate. They are beginning to understand that there is no way out." Her precise analysis reflected the changes we were all beginning to notice. Our combat routine had evolved. Yuri was developing increasingly sophisticated tactics for nighttime ambushes, taking advantage of our intimate knowledge of the ruins. Anton, now recovered from his injuries, was training other young soldiers in the urban survival techniques we had perfected. One night, during a reconnaissance mission with Vasily, we witnessed something surprising: German soldiers abandoning their positions to surrender. "It's like watching an empire crumble," whispered Vasily as we watched through our binoculars. "But don't let your guard down. A wounded animal is more dangerous." Hunger remained our constant companion, but the German situation was even worse. We found more and more abandoned equipment, a clear sign of their growing desperation. Dmitri, ever the optimist, began planning how we would turn the German bunkers into shelters for civilians after victory. Ivan organized the communication system between the different sectors using coded messages in Russian and English. My knowledge of English finally proved useful beyond conversations with Commissar Petrov. "Two languages, one message," joked Ivan. "The message is always the same: resist." Natasha, our tireless nurse, set up a makeshift hospital in the basements of the factory. With limited resources, she worked real miracles. One evening, I found her crying silently after losing a young soldier. Sometimes, she told me, victory comes at too high a price. The cold was still relentless, but we had learned to use it to our advantage. The Germans, ill-equipped for the Russian winter, suffered more than we did. Sergei once commented, "General Winter fights alongside us, but he doesn't distinguish friend from foe." His words carried the bitter wisdom of experience. Stories from home became more frequent in our nightly conversations. It was as if the proximity of victory allowed us to dream of the future again. Marina talked about going back to teaching mathematics. Yuri planned to rebuild his hometown, and I thought about how I would tell this story to the world. Commissioner Petrov kept meticulous records of our operations. One evening, he showed me his diaries. "When this war is over," he said, "people will want to forget. Our duty is to remember not just the violence, but the humanity that survived it." The battles now had a different purpose. We were no longer fighting just to survive, but to win. Every position taken, every street secured brought us closer to the end. Anton said he could feel the change in the air like the arrival of spring after a long winter. Our unit had become a family forged in the fire of battle. We shared not only danger and hardship, but also small joys. A pack of cigarettes, found a letter from home, a moment of silence under the stars. It was these moments that reminded us why we were fighting. The sound of Soviet artillery now came from all directions surrounding the Germans. For us, it was a symphony of hope. For them, a requiem. Vasily kept a map on which he marked every position, recaptured every meter of Stalingrad liberated. The circle was closing inexorably. At the end of January 1943, I noticed a significant change in the Stalingrad air. It wasn't just the biting cold or the smoke from the fighting, it was something deeper, a feeling shared by all of us that the siege was about to close in on the Germans for good. "Bradley, come and see this," Marina called out one morning from her observation post. Through her telescopic rifle, I saw German soldiers burning documents. It was an unmistakable sign. Commissioner Petrov confirmed our suspicions. The German Sixth Army was trapped with no hope of rescue. Our unit stepped up operations. Yuri led increasingly daring raids, taking advantage of the enemy's growing desperation. Anton, who had become a veteran at the age of 18, trained the new recruits with an efficiency that surprised me. Every move must have purpose, he taught. Here, hesitation means death. Natasha set up a new medical post closer to the front lines. "The Germans are too weak to counterattack," she explained, organizing her few supplies. "Now it's our turn to put pressure on them." Her courage inspired all of us, even in the darkest moments. Ivan kept a detailed record of our final operations. "History needs to know how we finished," he would say, jotting down each advance in his battered notebook. Not just the victory, but the human cost. His words carried the weight of all the comrades we had lost. The cold was still relentless, but now was our most effective ally. The Germans, ill-equipped and demoralized, were quickly succumbing. Sergei commented one evening, as we shared our meager rations, "It's ironic that the same winter that almost killed us is now our greatest weapon." Dmitry hasn't abandoned his seeds. Even in the last days of combat, he continued to plan for the future. "When all this is over," he insisted, "we'll turn every crater into a garden." His unwavering faith in tomorrow gave us the strength to carry on. Commissar Petrov brought us together more often, sharing news of the Soviet advance. "Every hour," he said, "the siege gets tighter. It's only a matter of time." His words were confirmed by the ever closer sounds of Soviet artillery. Marina set up a communication system with other units using light signals at night. "The Germans are so focused on surviving that they don't even notice," she explained, adjusting her makeshift mirror. It was further proof of how our adaptability had become our greatest strength. Vasily continued to keep track of casualties, but now he also included the German soldiers who surrendered. "It's important to remember that they're human too," he said one evening. "When the war is over, we'll need to rebuild more than just buildings." The last few weeks were the most intense. Every street, every building we took represented another nail in the coffin of the Sixth Army. The constant sound of gunfire and explosions was gradually replaced by something even more disturbing: the silence of the defeated. On February 2nd, 1943, I witnessed something I will never forget. German officers, including generals, emerged from their bunkers with white flags. Commissar Petrov was by my side when we saw the surrender begin. "Watch carefully, Bradley," he said, his voice breaking. "This is the moment when history changes course." Victory at Stalingrad came not with a bang, but with an exhausted sigh of relief. As we watched the endless lines of German prisoners, I realized that all of us, Soviets, Germans, and me, an American, had been transformed by this battle. In the days that followed, I began to understand the true meaning of our victory. It was not just a military triumph, but a testament to human endurance. Each of us would forever bear the scars of Stalingrad, not just on our bodies, but on our souls. Today, decades later, I still dream of those devastated streets and the faces of the comrades we lost. But I also remember the extraordinary courage, unwavering solidarity, and fierce determination that I witnessed. Stalingrad wasn't just a battle, it was proof of what human beings are capable of when they fight for something greater than themselves.